This week we're talking about two different related things. Well, not really different, but a general and a more specific version of the same thing. Poetry is conversation. Ignore this week 3, that we're actually in week 4. That's a revision of my class. So in general, the point, as you read in the lecture, is that poets respond to other poets. We saw this last week. We saw Blake responding to himself because he was Blake in The Lamb and the Tiger, but we also saw Rich responding to Donne in The Valediction Forbidding Morning, and in fact we've been seeing poets respond to other poets all semester long, but now we're pointing it out. And sometimes it makes a lot more sense to think about the poems as part of an ongoing conversation than to try to focus on what this individual poem is saying in isolation, when in fact it was not expected to be in isolation. So this fits into our issue of historical versus ahistorical. This is a kind of historical reading of poems. It has all the problems that any historical reading of a poem has, but it also has the virtues. It's expected, for example, that if you read Spring by Edna St. Vincent Millay, you will already know about Whitman, because everybody who reads poetry knows Whitman, right? Except, of course, students who are really coming to it seriously for the first time. So you might be expected then to miss something. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start by thinking about poetry as conversation in general, and then poetry as a conversation specifically about poetry. So we're starting to look at Millay, and I'm going to just bring her poem up quickly if I can. I have many more poems in this list than I need, but I didn't have a chance to cut it down. So here's the Millay poem. To what purpose, April, do you return again? Beauty is not enough. You can no longer quiet me with the redness of little leaves opening stickily. I know what I know. The sun is hot on my neck as I observe the spikes of crocus. The smell of the earth is good. It is apparent that there is no death. And I'm going to pause right there. It is apparent that there is no death. If you've been reading poetry, you realize this is a quotation of Walt Whitman. This is a quotation of a specific line in section 6 of Song of Myself, the conclusion of that poem. And her poem has nothing to do with what Millay thinks about spring, at least almost nothing to do with what Millay thinks about spring, and everything to do with what Millay thinks about Whitman's use of spring in order to give him consolation. Right? It is apparent that there is no death in Whitman means that life goes on, and as he says, death is different from what anyone supposed and luckier. That's how he ends that section of that poem. And she says, I agree with you, Walt Whitman, there is no death, but what does that signify? I'm not convinced that your meaning of the fact that there is no death tells us about life. So she's agreeing with him. She's saying, I agree with you, Walt, but I disagree about the implications. We read the same thing in the book of nature, but we disagree about the interpretation. And here's the part of Walt Whitman that she's referring to. This is the end. This is my third slide. I'm not going to put the other two up. He's talking about grass as the uncut hair of graves. And he says, what do you think has become of the young and old men? What do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life and does not wait at the end to arrest it, and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses. So he's very happy with death. He thinks it's a sign. The grass is proof that death does not exist. She agrees death does not exist, but she doesn't relish, apparently, the thought of being turned into grass. So this is just one way that poets speak to each other. I agree, but. And there's other ways, of course. There's the I disagree way. And so I want to look at another poem kind of in the same series. This poem tends to give students trouble. And I'll tell you before I read it that the reason it gives students trouble is very simple. It's because it's one long, complicated sentence. If you can figure out the grammar of the poem, the trouble disappears. So let's do that. But first I'll read it from the beginning to the end. And keeping in mind, because it's a single sentence, you have to read it as a single sentence. You can't isolate certain lines here and there and base a judgment on those lines if you don't see how those lines fit into the sentence. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind, that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener, who listens in the snow, and, nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. So before we do any interpreting of the poem, let's just see if we can actually read the poem. And so let's talk about some parallel clauses here. One must have a mind of winter to do what? To regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. Now, there's another part to this sentence. Ignore that semicolon for now, because the sentence, that's not, as it usually is, the ending of what we call an independent clause, a group of words that could stand alone as a sentence. The sentence is now going to be suspended. And one must, right? Take that one must down, even though it's not there grammatically, it's implied. And one must have been cold a long time to behold the juniper shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun. Okay, now we have a second semicolon. That ends, that signals the end of these two parallel sentence constructions or clauses. And not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind. Right? So, to say this a little differently, you have to have a mind of winter, whatever that is, and you have to have been cold a long time, not to think of misery in the sound of the wind. I mean, that's what the sentence is saying. Or to put it in a rougher paraphrase, if you have a mind of winter and have been cold a long time, then you won't think of misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener, who listens in the snow, and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. Very, very cold poem. So let's take it a little bit further. So if you've been cold a long time, and you have a mind of winter, we still don't know what that is, you will hear the wind, and you'll be able to hear something other than misery in that sound. All right, so the question to ask at this point, I think, is not what does it mean to have a mind of winter, but why would you, if you don't have a mind of winter and have not been cold a long time, think of misery when you hear the sound of the wind blowing in the winter? And I think that's obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. It sounds like a moan. In the winter, you've all heard it, when the wind blows through the bare trees. If you're outside listening, it sounds like a moan. And that's the sound people make when they're miserable. So you have the idea that nature is moaning. Unless you have a mind of winter. Unless you've been cold a long time. And then you won't hear any misery in the sound of the wind. Why won't you hear any misery of the sound of the wind? Because there is no misery in the sound of the wind. It's just wind. But you have to be a listener who listens in the snow, outside in the cold, who's experienced this, and who is nothing himself, so that you can behold nothing that is not there, which is a moaning, living thing, and the nothing that is there. So you could say this is a poem about the lack of voice in nature, the lack of any, let's say, divinity in nature. So this is a response to the poetry of William Wordsworth, to the poetry of Walt Whitman, to the poetry of all of those poets known as Romantics. We're going to talk about that later in the term, who found meaning or God in nature. Stevens is responding to an entire century of poetry to say, just like Millay does, what you thought was there was not there. You didn't have a mind of winter. I'll let you guys figure out what you think that means, because although I could easily tell you, I think that I might tell you what I think it means, and I'd rather you told me what you think it means. But we all know it means to be cold a long time. In rough, easy terms, if you've got the experience, then you know there's nothing there. But if you don't, then like those foolish people, Whitman and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and Shelley and Blake and all sorts of other poets, you think there's something there. That's a very superficial, easy kind of reading of this poem. There's a million things left to say about this poem. But let's move on. Say those in the discussion board. So this is also a poem that students tend to need help with. So it's not, I think, as much in that category as Sonia Gurney's poem, but these poems are in conversation with each other. So Donald Justice wrote Minuteforty, a famous poem by a famous poet, and but it was all about men, and Sonia wanted to write a response to it, so she wrote Women at 40. But it's a different kind of response. She's not going to be criticizing Justice and saying, you're wrong. She's simply going to be saying, what you say may be true of men at 40, but what about women? So I want to, before I read it, to note that there should be a line break here where the capital O is. I don't know how that happened. Men at 40 learn to close softly the doors to rooms they will not be coming back to. At rest on a stair landing, they feel it moving beneath them, now like the deck of a ship, though the swell is gentle. And deep in mirrors they rediscover the face of the boy as he practices tying his father's tie there in secret. And the face of that father still warm with the mystery of lather. They are more fathers than sons themselves now. Something is filling them. Something that is like the twilight sound of the crickets, immense, filling the woods at the foot of the slope behind their mortgaged houses. So Justice is asking you to contemplate a series of images to understand what it's like for a man to hit the beginnings of middle age. A man at 40 has about 40 years left to live. And that's an experience that a poet just is drawn to. So this poem didn't have another poem behind it that I know of. Justice just wrote it. So he says that men at 40 learn to close softly the doors to rooms they will not be coming back to. So this the symbolic gesture to close a door softly, and also a metaphor. The door is a metaphor. So you might ask, and I won't answer this, I'm just going to raise it for you to think about. Why are they closing the door softly? And what is the room they will not be coming back to? This also could be literal, by the way. I mean, that literally is another way to close the door, which is appropriate for this man at 40, or men at 40. So when they're at rest at a stair landing, they feel it moving beneath them now like the deck of a ship, though the jet swell is gentle. Again, a literal statement full of suggestion. It's both literal and metaphoric. Right? Why, literally, would you feel the stairs of the landing of the stairway moving beneath you? Why is the swell gentle? And deep in mirrors they rediscover the face of the boy as he practices tying his father's tie there in secret. I don't think I need to explain that. And the face of that father still warm with the mystery of lather. They are more fathers than sons themselves now. It's true, if their fathers are still alive, they're quite old. And they probably are still alive. They're probably mid-60s to 70 years old. Something is filling them, something that is like the twilight sound. Right? So something. He doesn't tell you what that is, so he invites you to speculate. There's something like that is like the twilight sound of the crickets. Why crickets? And this is the time of year when crickets make their noises. Why crickets? Filling the woods at the foot of the slope. Why at the foot of the slope? Why behind their mortgaged houses? There's a literal slope, there's a figurative slope, there's the metaphor of the slope. There's a literal mortgaged house, there's the metaphor of a mortgaged house. What is that metaphor? So I'd say this is, however you read it, however long it takes to meditate through this poem, as deep as you want to go into it. I think we can agree it's kind of an ominous sounding poem. This is not the sound of a happy person. Kind of a melancholy poem. Coming to grips with being 40. Well, women also have to come to grips with being 40. And so I would say this is just a complimentary poem. It's not a criticism. It's just a way of looking at something else, or looking at women instead of men turning 40. And she sees something different. The experience of a woman being 40, according to Sonia Gurnis, is something different from the experience of a man turning 40, and I think that's probably true. Women at 40 wear their skin like phases of the moon, like crescents of pleasure bent to catch all angles of light. The slippery solstice, the fragile truce of noon. Fresh from sleep, they are assured that yesterday's paleness was but a sag of light, an inconsequent fading. Yet they wear their fullness conscious of its snagged regrets, the lines that web against the blooming. Women at 40 afford the dark side as the wound grows tighter. They learn the shift of the lover's eyes, his taste for firmer flesh. The secrets he is still avoiding, again and again they've kissed the skull beneath the lover's grin. Know as surely as they know his thrust that what is full will soon be waning. When sadness comes, women at 40 go without fear to a shuttered room, bless themselves, bed down, believing that each effacement is but a rest, a teasing dark before they ride again, pushing the clouds from their right of way, pulling the sea behind them. So this poem turns on the metaphor of the moon. Right? They wear their skin like the phases of the moon. From time immemorial, women have been associated with the moon. Diana is the goddess of the moon. And so this idea of phases of the moon runs through the poem and captures how a woman of 40 thinks about herself. So here we see the phase of the moon in action. Fresh from sleep, they are sure that yesterday's paleness was but a sag. Yesterday the moon looked a little different, and you think, the moon is growing smaller, and the next day it's a little bigger. You say, no, I was wrong, it's a little bigger. Or you looked at yourself in the mirror and you said, oh dear, I have a wrinkle. No, that's okay. Although it's not a wrinkle, it's paleness. My skin is growing pale. No, that was just inconsequent. I'm wrong. Today I look just fine. I don't know what I was thinking. They wear their fullness like the fullness of the moon, conscious of its snagged regrets, the lines that web against the blooming. So this is a woman who's very conscious, what are we seeing, of her body, which is not as prominent in Donald Justice's poem. Women at 40 afford the dark side. Is the suggestion that women at 20 or 30 can't afford the dark side? They're in denial about the dark side. What is the dark side? But women at 40 can afford it. How can they afford it? Well, as the wound grows tighter, they learn the shift in the lover's eye, his taste for firmer flesh. The suggestion being that the lover of a woman at 40 may well be perfectly faithful to her, but is regretting perhaps what's happening to her body. The secrets he is still avoiding. Well, that gives her some superiority to a man at 40, doesn't it? Again and again, they've kissed the skull because they can afford the dark side. They know that what is full will soon be waning because they're women. He's denying that, but that's the moon, right? When sadness comes, women at 40 go without fear. Isn't that nice? They go without fear to a shuttered room. Men may not go without fear. Bless themselves. She may be in a confessional. I'll tell you, I knew Sonia many years ago when we were both at Notre Dame. She was a teacher. I was a graduate student. And since I know her from Notre Dame, the image of a confessional springs to mind when she talks about shuttered room and blessing yourself. However, that might be my historical reading leading me astray. They bed down believing that each effacement is but a rest, right? Effacement, again, think of the moon, a teasing dark before they ride again. Doing what the moon does, pushing the clouds from their right of way, pulling the sea behind them. So it ends with this image of power, unlike Donald Justice, who's ending with the cricket sounds in a mortgaged house. So she used Donald Justice to jump off and have a conversation about how women are different at 40 than men are different at 40. All right, let's just do a couple more without spending too much time on it. In addition to poetry being a conversation, I said that poetry is a conversation about poetry. In the interview you heard with Donald Hall and Collins, you heard that poets have very few subjects. One of the subjects that, however, was not mentioned, which fit into the list of, I don't know, love, death, separation, I forgot what else he put on his list. That's Billy Collins. You could have added poetry. Poets love to talk about poetry. That's hardly surprising. They're almost always talking about poetry. In fact, you could say that every time they write a poem, they are at least to some extent talking about poetry. We've seen several examples of that already. Some pretty directly, and some just by implication. So Hausman's poem is directly about poetry, and Moore's poem is even called poetry. So that's very directly about poetry. And Ars Poetica, that means the art of poetry. And that's the second poem I think we've seen with that title, Ars Poetica. It is. The first one was in week 1. So there's a lot of poems about poetry. Last week we had Shakespeare's Sonnet 130. That was a poem about poetry. So let's look at a couple of these. Emily Dickinson. This is sometimes printed as 8 straight lines and sometimes printed as 2 sets of 4 lines, 2 stanzas. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So this is Emily Dickinson's theory of poetry. She says that poetry should tell all the truth, but tell it slant. What does she mean by slant? Does she mean, say, indirectly? I think so, because she says, success in circuit lies. Instead of going directly, go indirectly. That must be her spelling of circuit. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. And this is why it has to be told slant, indirectly, because the truth's superb surprise is too bright for our infirm delight. What is our infirm delight? Infirm means sick. Is our ability to take pleasure sick? And so the truth is wonderful, but like too much sugar, it's too sweet. Like too much light, it's too bright. What is it about us and about truth that makes us somewhat incompatible? But I want you to notice that the job of a poem is to tell all the truth, not to hide the truth, to tell it all. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. If I told you the truth, you would be blind. So I'm going to tell you the truth, but I'm going to tell the truth to you slowly so that you won't go blind, like a frog being boiled to death by slowly raising its temperature, although that's hardly dazzling. All right, one more. This poem by Walt Whitman is far too long for me to even read the whole thing to you. You have to do that on your own, but I'm going to give you some pointers on how to read it. The first thing I want you to notice is that the first stanza, although it is quite long, is one sentence. You have to read it as one sentence. Not only is it one sentence, it is an introductory sentence. It's like the preamble or the overture. I think that's a better word. It's like the overture to a musical that incorporates all the themes of what will follow. And so you're not really expected to understand everything that's going on. You're just hearing the themes that will be developed in the course of this long poem. So I'm going to read the first stanza, the first long sentence, which covers more than one slide, to show you a few things that make it easier to read. So, announcement of the themes. Out of the cradle, endlessly rocking, out of the mockingbird's throat, the musical shuttle, out of the 9th month midnight, over the sterile sands and the fields beyond, where the child, leaving his bed, wandered alone, bareheaded, barefooted, down from the showered halo, up from the mystic play of shadows twining and twisting as if they were alive, out from the patches of briars and blackberries, from the memories of the bird that chanted to me, from your memories, sad brother, from the fitful risings and fallings I heard, from under that yellow half-moon late risen and swollen, as if with tears, from those beginning notes of yearning and love there in the mist, from the 1,000 responses of my heart never to cease, from the myriad fence-aroused words, from the words stronger and more delicious than any, from such as now they start the scene revisiting as a flock twittering rising, or overhead passing. Born hither, ere all eludes me, hurriedly, a man, yet by these tears a boy again, throwing myself on the sand, confronting the waves, I, chanter of pains and joys, uniter of here and hereafter, taking all hints to use them, but swiftly leaping beyond them, a reminiscence, sing. All right, so this is a sentence that has a lot of parts, but at the heart of it is a very simple subject, I, and a very simple verb, sing. I sing. What does he sing? A reminiscence. I sing a memory is the core of this sentence. That memory I sing it out of the cradle endlessly rocking, out of the mockingbird's throat, etc., etc. The mockingbird is very important. It happens in September, etc. All of these things are going to come up throughout the poem. The next thing that you need to understand to read this poem well is that there are 2 times happening simultaneously. There's the time of memory, I sing a reminiscence, and there's the time of the singing of that memory. And both of them are important. Something happened many years ago when the poet was a boy. Something is happening now as he sings the song and recovers that memory. All right? So think of yourself telling the story of how you lost the keys to your car, and in the course of telling that story, remembered where the keys were. He's telling the story of what transformed him into a poet, but he's only understanding that that happened now, many years later. Right? So if you follow those 2 times and you follow this complex opening, you will understand the story that the rest of the poem tells. Once you've done that, you can understand what Whitman says about poetry, what makes a person a poet rather than a non-poet, right? Let's say you may not feel you're a poet, but Whitman thinks he is a poet. Whitman believes he is a poet. Well, what's the difference between you and Whitman? What does he have? What can he do that you don't have or can't do? Right? You can only answer those questions once you understand what's going on in the poem. All right, so that should be plenty for this week to chew on. Good luck.